Well, thanks, Daniel, and welcome everybody. And I think it's important we all thank Daniel and the whole team at Spectrum for organising today's event. What a fantastic venue. So thank you. All search companies aren't the same. And we obviously go back quite some time. Every interaction I've ever had with Daniel, I've come away feeling informed, energized, engaged. And I have to say that his knowledge, particularly of the TMT sector, whether it's startups, PE-owned businesses, or large multinationals, is very, very impressive. So I've come away from all kinds of conversations with him thinking, well, this is like talking to somebody from the Harvard Business Review, only clearer. So always a pleasure. So if you haven't had the pleasure, make sure you have a chat with him later on in the morning. So the wisdom in this room is going to be far in excess of anything that any individual speaker could give to you. So this is really an exercise in sharing knowledge and experience, know-how and observation. And I'd like to cover 4 things in the session this morning. I'd like to begin with my experience and observation, largely from corporate life. I'd then like to share with you the insights from my interviews that I had with these 30 chairmen of FTSE 350 PLCs. I'd then like to just spend a little bit of time on some wider aspects of leadership before concluding on what can the effective non-executive director do to help avoid board dysfunctionality. So let's begin with some enablers of effectiveness for non-executive directors. And I believe that it's about people, structure and behaviour. Let's start with a few first principles. So the chair runs the board. The CEO runs the company. The board owns the strategy, and the CEO, together with the executive committee, owns the execution of that strategy. The chair is there to support, as in back or sack, the CEO. And so I think clarity around those responsibilities is really the foundation. Now, I once had the pleasure of speaking to Mervyn Davis when he was running Standard Chartered Bank. And he said, well, Ian, as chairman of the bank, there are very few things that I can do before I start stepping on the toes of the chief executive. And he said, I can really do only 3 things. I can set the budget, I can allocate capital, and I can get serious about people in terms of who's on the team, performance, and succession. Now, of course, the board is clearly responsible for governance, testing strategy, managing risk, holding management to account, approving major decisions, and running succession. And perhaps there's a watchword for effectiveness amongst non-execs, which I quite like, which is this principle of eyes in, fingers out. And I think that these enablers, if we look at them, let's start with right people. Well, of course, non-executive directors have got to have deep functional competence. They need huge reserves of experience and they need breadth. And there's something else in terms of attitude, team orientation, style of contribution, the commitment that they bring, and of course the drive for value, whether it's shareholder value in quoted companies or private owner value in PE or even family-owned businesses. But the structure contains relationships which need to be run effectively. So are there the right relationships between the CEO, the non-execs, the chair, the investors? Where those are running effectively, risks can be managed, there is visibility of the right things, and also what I call governance light. In other words, the governance processes don't disproportionately crowd out the other things that the board needs to cover. And then in terms of right behaviour as an enabler, I think we would all agree that it starts with the person chairing the organisation. And the role of the effective non-executive director here, I see as fair, effective challenge. And that relationship with the chair is important in terms of candid feedback, particularly about behaviour. And then there are other things, non-confrontation, the application of emotional intelligence, curiosity, learning. And here's an interesting one, a willingness to resign. You're probably wondering what that means. Profound implications for remuneration here. Now, of course, reward for non-execs must be sufficient to attract, motivate, and retain the very best. But I think it shouldn't be so huge that if a point of principle arises, the non-exec feels that they simply can't resign because they need the money. So I believe that non-execs need attitude. They're team players, not bystanders, and their skills match the evolving and future needs of the organisation. So a particular area where the effective non-executive director can make a real impact, I think, is in the tone from the top. A lot of headhunters I've spoken to over the years say that when they are recruiting non-execs, they apply a 3C model: confidence, competence, and commitment. Nothing unusual about that. In corporate life, I've been involved with lean processes, lean manufacturing, lean service delivery. And within the lean discipline, there's another 3C model: concern, cause, and countermeasure. And I had one of those kind of light bulb moments. I must have been having one of those conversations with Daniel again. And it suddenly occurred to me that these two models actually fit together, because it takes confidence to raise a concern. It takes competence to ask the right questions that enable the executive to get to the root cause analysis that really gets to the bottom of the issue. It takes real commitment from the non-execs to guide, help, challenge, ask the right questions on what are the sustainable countermeasures that wrestle the problem to the ground. And if you're thinking, as I did, well, that's a pretty simplistic model, Ian, let's just reflect on the newspapers, because over the years, the journalists have been asking some pretty similar questions when things don't go right. And for those of us who can go back a few years, the journalists were asking questions: where were the non-execs at Polypec? Where were they in the Robert Maxwell situation? Where were they at Bearings, KPM Quest, Marconi, Enron, Nortel, Lehman's? And last week, where were they at HBOS? And the list goes on and on. So I believe that the tone from the top, as influenced by effective non-executive directors, is about behavioural leadership. It's this concept of smell the air, the ethical compass, even the moral compass of the organisation, and the impact that that has on the culture. And of course, engagement with the person chairing the organisation is extremely important. Perhaps even more important is developing a relationship with the executive committee and people below the board without going offside with the CEO. And that's where it can be quite delicate. But I believe it's what enables non-execs to understand what's really going on 1, 2, 3 levels down. And that enables non-execs to ask the question, are we really being briefed on the topics that we really need to know about? And so that quality of relationship is perhaps mediated by the shadow that we cast, how our behavioural leadership influences. And there's another aspect about tone from the top, and that's diversity. And I don't just mean gender diversity, I'm talking about this in the widest possible sense of diversity of view, of experience, of functional capability, of particular expertise. It's all about breadth. But I do want to give you a very interesting example from gender diversity. In a board evaluation that I was personally running earlier this year, I was interviewing one of the male non-execs, and he said, well, Ian, this is a very effective board. We've been together a long time. It's extremely well organised. It's very well chaired. And we really know each other very well. I thought, great. And then I interviewed one of the lady non-executive directors, and she said, well, Ian, this is a very good board. It's extremely well organised. It's very well chaired. And it's very professional. Good, good. And then she stopped herself mid-sentence, and she said, do you know what? I really don't think we know each other. So as you can imagine, there's a very interesting debate going on in that organisation about the reality of those relationships across the boardroom table. Now, boards are getting smaller, and increasingly we're seeing on the executive side a chief executive officer, a CFO, and not that many others, which means that the reliance on the non-exec population, particularly for functional skill, is ever more important. So that brings me to my research on board effectiveness evaluation. I think a lot of research done to date has focused on the FTSE 100. And what I wanted to do was focus on companies at the lower end of the FTSE 350. So I interviewed the chairman, and they were all men, of 30 such companies. And I think there are some lessons for the wider aspects of other organisations. So the main headlines: board evaluations are alive and well, and there is a genuine desire to improve. Process issues are largely under control, and it provided a very valuable insight into the interpersonal dynamics, such as what happens when directors are insufficiently prepared or use inappropriate language or behaviour or aren't solving conflict collaboratively. But also there was a surprising lack of interest from the external stakeholders, shareholders and owners. And I would have thought that they would see board evaluation perhaps as a source of competitive advantage in being really serious about performance. Now, this research was kindly published by Ashridge Business School, who sent printed copies to every chairman in the whole of the FTSE 350. So some useful pointers. How to avoid box ticking in evaluating a board? Well, it's about getting to the heart of the issue, using evaluations as a force for change, driving a performance culture, and enabling what I call this behavioural leadership. And within that, the crucial role of the effective non-executive director is fair, effective challenge. So I'd like to give us 4 quotes from these chairmen, and perhaps we can reflect on the role that a non-executive director can play in addressing these 4 issues, because I think that's where there's incredible value add. So here we go. Evaluations work best when you get the elephant on the table. It takes time to get into this. There are barriers to break down. We need to find a way of engaging the whole board to discuss the difficult issues. And finally, the process forces people to think about what we should really be talking about. So, the recommendations. The chairman's level of engagement is key, and the commitment, not just box-ticking compliance. And everybody needs to be prepared to receive messages that perhaps they may not want to hear. Just get buy-in. Everybody needs to be supportive, and it's incumbent upon the chair to explain what's going to happen, how, why, and when, to enable candid discussion. And then everybody must be willing to discuss the findings openly. So perhaps the watchword here is that if it's worth doing at all, it's worth doing well. Next, choose your evaluator carefully. A number of evaluators are from professional services or search firms, so they need to demonstrate business understanding and real rapport with the organisation. One thing that was quite consistent was that Chairman was saying to me, there is a bit of a potential conflict of interest in the search community, because are they really going to criticise a director that they've put into the company? Or if they do criticise somebody, is there a subtext around business development? Next area, give feedback. There's little point starting this if there's no action and follow-up. And so chairs need to confront issues, particularly of style, behaviour, quality of contribution, as well as the quantity and the professionalism and the content of contribution. So such feedback should be private, individual and personal, with a focus on development. And that currently is quite rare. But I think that giving feedback, particularly to non-execs, really is important. I had the pleasure of speaking to Virginia Bottomley recently, who, as you know, is a former cabinet minister and now runs a board practice. And she said, today, all the big problems in business actually are people problems. So the final area on recommendations from the board evaluation report are about setting the tone for the organisation. Because I really believe that this tone from the top concept is underestimated. The influence of the board is a core determinant of culture and ethics and integrity and compliance. So the board, as I mentioned, needs to smell the air, monitor it, and find out what's going on whilst staying on side with the CEO. And sometimes there are situations where there are no rules, which is where, of course, organisations fall back on the values and the espoused behaviours. Which perhaps brings us to some wider issues about leadership. So let's just have one slide on that. I had the pleasure of meeting Lord Dannatt, formerly General Sir Richard Dannatt, who has some fascinating ideas about leadership. And he said, all leaders have this ability to take their followers to places that they didn't want to go to or didn't expect to go to. But they have a vision which they can articulate. And the followers give them legitimacy because of that vision. And that comes from the followers' conviction that the leaders are acting in their best interests and continuing to represent their best interests. Because let's face it, we've all got iPads or whatever the latest gadget is, and in a wiki world of ubiquitous information, simply barking out orders just doesn't work anymore. And I believe that the effective non-executive director has a role to play in that leadership tone. And in particular, because the immediate neighbours of tolerance are indifference and apathy. So with that in mind, the next slide is colourful. Deliberately so. Are we ready? These are some pitfalls where I think non-execs can help the board improve or avoid falling into some traps. How many of us have seen 2 or more of these before? I'm sure we all have. But perhaps the question to hold up the mirror is, what did we do about it? And perhaps the lesson here is that the time to deal with a problem is before it becomes a bigger problem. Lack of focus, backward looking, bickering, too much time spent on the here and now rather than what's over the horizon. Inadequate structure, lack of drive, a groupthink loving, insufficient breadth, not enough diversity. We've all seen them. So what of dysfunctionality in boards? The research confirmed these elements. It all starts with a lack of trust and then moves into inadequate conflict resolution. then not enough commitment, lack of accountability, culminating in insufficient focus on results. And so there are perhaps some warning signs about dysfunctionality in boards. And here are just a few. Has anyone not seen these warning signs? So not reaching decisions, us and them, campaigning. And I love this one. The answer was not remotely close to the question. Wrong information, unprepared, often surprised, and then the balance between challenge and support isn't there. It's the wrong environment. What is required is high challenge and even higher levels of mutual support. But when I thought about these, it occurred to me, actually, most of these warning signs are behavioural. So to conclude, let's draw some themes together. I believe that the enablers include right people, right structure, right behaviour, and that the effective non-executive director will build trust, effective conflict resolution, build commitment, clear accountability, and ensure that there is that focus on results. They will welcome board evaluation as a constructive exercise, and by doing that properly, they will commit to the process, in a collaborative way secure buy-in. They'll ensure that the evaluator is chosen correctly and carefully, and they will be open to feedback. And through all of that, their behavioural leadership will set the tone from the top. And throughout, they'll have their eyes in and their fingers out of the business, and they will drive for value creation or value realisation. So thank you very much for your attendance and for listening. Thank you.